The assembly rooms at Fenwick House were lit for the third ball of the winter season, and every candle in every sconce had been trimmed to burn at its brightest, so that the light fell without mercy on the woman who stood alone at the edge of the floor in a gown the color of weak tea. Marianne Whitcomb knew the exact age of that gown. She had worn it to her father's last dinner 4 years before, when the silk had still held its shape and the hem had not yet been turned twice to hide the fraying. Around her the room glittered like the inside of a jewel box, and she stood at its rim in her thin muslin, her gloved hands folded, her chin level, and pretended she could not hear the 2 young women behind her. They were not whispering. That was the thing she would remember. They did not lower their voices at all. "The charity case is here again," one of them said, and the other laughed, a small, bright sound like a spoon against china, and Marianne felt the heat climb her throat the way it always did, and she did not turn, and she did not answer, and she counted the panes in the tall window across the room until the counting steadied her. She had learned to be still. Stillness was the only wealth she had left, and she spent it, carefully. What none of them knew, what the whole glittering room had decided it did not need to know, was that she had come tonight for one reason only, and that reason had nothing to do with dancing or being seen. She had come because a man she had never met had sent word that he wished to engage a music teacher for his household, and the housekeeper who arranged such things had told her to present herself where the family would be. So she stood at the edge of the light and waited to be looked at, which was a different thing entirely from wanting to be seen. Stay with me here, because the woman at the edge of that room is about to be looked at by the one person in it whose looking could undo everything the season had decided about her. She does not know that yet, and neither, quite, does he. 4 years earlier, Marianne had not stood at any edge. Her father, Mr. Edmund Whitcomb, had been a gentleman of comfortable means and uncomfortable optimism, a man who loved music more than money and trusted people more than either. When the bank in which he had placed the bulk of his fortune failed, it took with it not only the house and the carriage and the little collection of instruments he had gathered across 30 years, but also, within the same hard winter, the man himself. He died in February, of a fever that a stronger constitution might have survived, and Marianne had always believed, though she never said it aloud, that it was not the fever that killed him, but the shame. She had been 22 then. She was 26 now. In the arithmetic of the season, those 4 years were not 4 years, but 4 failures, 4 winters, in which she had not married, 4 springs in which she had not been chosen. The room had done its sums and arrived at its verdict, and the verdict was that Marianne Whitcomb was a woman the world was finished with. She did not agree with the verdict. She simply lacked the standing to appeal it. What she had kept, when everything else was sold, was music. Her father had taught her to play before she could read, and after his death, she had found that the thing he loved had become the thing that fed her. She gave lessons in the mornings to the daughters of families who could afford a governess for deportment, but only a visiting teacher for the pianoforte. She was good, though few of her pupils' mothers troubled to notice. She was patient with clumsy hands and kind to frightened ones, and she asked for her small fee at the end of each month with a directness that some of those mothers found presumptuous in a woman who had once dined at their tables. The one thing she had refused to sell was a slim folder of manuscript pages, her father's own hand, the fair copies he had made of the pieces he loved best. She kept them folded inside her music case, and when a night was very bad, she took them out and read the notes the way another woman might read old letters. And she heard his voice in the shape of the phrases, and she was, for the length of a movement, not alone. She had brought the folder tonight. She could not have said why. Perhaps because she did not trust the household she was going to, and wished to keep near her the one thing no household could take. Across the room, Julian Hartley, Viscount Ashcroft, stood at the head of the floor and watched the woman in the tea-colored gown pretend not to hear the 2 girls behind her. He had been in the assembly rooms for a quarter of an hour, and had spoken to no one he did not have to. He was not a man who enjoyed such gatherings, and the season regarded this reluctance as either arrogance or grief, and could not decide which, and so had settled on calling him cold. The Viscount is cold, the mothers told their daughters, but a Viscount all the same, and 34, and unmarried, and in possession of an estate in Somerset that ran to £11,000 a year. Coldness could be forgiven a great deal. He watched the woman count the window panes. He knew that was what she was doing, because he had done the same thing once, in a room very like this one, when he was younger, and had not yet learned to stand still. He watched the color climb her throat, and watched her refuse to let it reach her face, and something in him that had been shut for a long time turned over in the dark like a sleeper disturbed. What Marianne did not know, what no one in that room knew, was that the Viscount had a sister once. Her name did not matter to the season. It mattered a great deal to him. He crossed half the floor before he had decided to, and stopped, because a man of his rank did not simply walk up to an unintroduced woman at the edge of a ball, and he stood for a moment in the middle of the bright room, caught between the manners he had been raised in and the thing that had turned over inside him. Lady Fenwick, the dowager who owned the house and, by long custom the season that passed through it, had marked the Viscount's crossing the way a hawk marks a movement in the grass. She was a handsome woman of 60 with a fan. She held always a half-inch too high, and she had already decided several weeks ago that Ashcroft would do very nicely for her granddaughter Cecilia, and she had spent those weeks arranging the season so that the two of them would be thrown together as often as propriety allowed. She did not intend to watch her arrangements walk toward a music teacher in a turned gown. "Your lordship," she said, arriving at his elbow with Cecilia in tow, and the girl was lovely, truly lovely, in ice-blue satin with pearls at her throat, and she curtsied with the ease of a woman who had never once wondered whether she belonged in a room. "You must forgive the crush," Cecilia was just saying. She hoped you had not been left to stand alone. "I have not minded it," the Viscount said. His voice was level. He did not look at Cecilia. He was looking past both of them at the woman by the window, and Lady Fenwick, following the line of his gaze, felt the first small, cold touch of something she did not yet have a name for. "Ah!" she said, recovering, her fan rising another quarter-inch. "You have noticed our little charity case, Miss Wickham. Her father ruined himself and half of Bath with him, and now she teaches scales to tradesmen's children, and comes to our balls to be pitied. It is kind of the family's to admit her at all. One does not like to be unkind, but there are limits to what charity can accomplish." There it was again. The charity case. The second time Marianne would have heard it, had she been near enough to hear, and she was not, but the Viscount was, and he turned his head and looked at Lady Fenwick with an expression that made her fan pause in its ascent. Her father, he said, was Edmund Wickham. You knew him. Lady Fenwick's surprise was genuine. "I knew of him. He copied music. He sent a manuscript once. To a man I respected. A fair copy of a quartet the man had thought lost. He asked nothing for it. He said the music ought not to die merely because its owner had." The Viscount paused. "I was told the copyist was a gentleman of Bath who had lost his fortune. I did not know his name until now." Lady Fenwick did not know what to do with this. It did not fit the shape of the evening she had planned. "How singular," she said, and turned the subject to the orchestra, and Cecilia laughed at something that was not funny. And the Viscount let them talk and did not stop watching the woman by the window. Across the room, Marianne had begun to think the family she had come to meet was not present after all, and that she had stood in the cruel light for 2 hours for nothing, and she was calculating how soon she might leave without the leaving being remarked upon when a small commotion near the terrace doors drew her eye. A child had got loose. A boy of perhaps 6 in a nightshirt and one slipper, escaped from whatever nursery he belonged to, had wandered down into the ball and now stood frozen at the edge of the dancing, overwhelmed by the noise and the height of the strangers, his face crumpling toward the particular terror of a small person who has lost the way back. No one moved toward him. The dancers flowed around him. As water flows around a stone, and a footman started forward, and was called away by his mistress, and the boy's face began to come apart. Marianne was across the floor before she had thought about it. She knew what it was to be small and lost in a room that had decided not to see you. She knelt in her thin gown on the cold marble, putting herself between the child and the wall of moving legs. And she did not tell him not to cry, which is what people always told children and which never once in the history of the world had made a child stop. She asked him his name. "Thomas," he said, on a hiccup. "Thomas," she repeated, as though it were the most reasonable name a person could have. "I am Marianne. Do you know, Thomas, I believe you are the only sensible person in this entire room, because you have come down to see what all the fuss is about, and everyone else is only pretending they know." The boy's crumpling paused. "Shall we find where you belong? I am very good at finding things. I once found a whole quartet that everyone said was lost. She did not know why she said it. She had been thinking of her father." She held out her gloved hand, and the boy took it, and she rose and turned and found the entire near quarter of the ballroom, looking at her, and at the head of that quarter, close enough that she took an involuntary step back, stood the Viscount of Ashcroft, and his face was not cold at all. He had watched the whole of it. He had watched her cross the floor while the room did not, watched her kneel on the marble in a gown that could not spare the wear, watched her decline to shame the child for his fear. And he had heard, because he was nearby then, the thing she said about the quartet, and it landed in him like a key, turning in a lock he had forgotten was there. "That is my nephew," the Viscount said. His voice was low. "Thomas, my sister's boy. He is in my keeping." Marianne curtsied because one did, and because she did not know what else to do with her hands, now that the boy had released them and run to bury his face in his uncle's coat. "Then he is fortunate, my lord, to have someone to be kept by." It was a small sentence. She did not mean anything by it beyond courtesy. Yet the Viscount looked at her for a moment too long, and she saw something cross his face that she could not name, and then Lady Fenwick was there again, and Cecilia, and the moment folded shut like a fan. "You have seen. Now the thing, the room, did not hold on to it." The season is about to spend a great deal of effort persuading Marianne that it did not happen, and she is going to believe the season because believing it is easier than the alternative. The Viscount's household, it emerged, was the very household that had sought a music teacher, and the position was Marianne's if she would take it, and she took it because a woman who teaches scales to tradesmen's children does not refuse £11,000 a year's worth of pianoforte. She was to come to the house on Laura Place 3 mornings a week and teach the boy Thomas his notes. She told herself it was only a position. She told herself this on the walk to Laura Place the first morning, and again on the doorstep, and again in the music room with its tall windows and its instrument that had cost more than everything she owned. And she went on telling herself, until the Viscount appeared in the doorway on the second morning having no earthly reason to be there, and stood watching his nephew murder a scale and said nothing, and did not leave. "He is not musical, my lord," Marianne said when the boy had been sent to his breakfast, "but he is not unmusical either. He is only 6. It comes or it does not, and pushing does not help it come." "My sister played," the Viscount said. It was the first thing he had ever told her about himself. "She was better than this house deserved, was?" Marianne asked gently. Because the tense had a stone in it, he did not answer that. He crossed to the window instead, and stood with his back to her, and she saw his hand go to the breast of his coat, and rest there a moment, over the place where a man keeps the things he cannot part with, and then fall. "Teach him," the Viscount said, "whether it comes or not. Teach him kindly." And he left. "Come inside," he had said to her at the door that first morning, when she had hesitated on the step in the cold. "Sit down," he had said when she stood too long by the instrument, as though she had not the right to touch it. "Eat something," he said on the 4th morning when she had come without breakfast because breakfast was a luxury she budgeted, and he had rung for a tray without waiting for her answer. She heard the commands and read them as coldness, as a great man ordering a servant, and she was wrong, and the reader could see she was wrong and she could not, because her wound would not let her. There was a morning in the 3rd week when the boy stumbled through a passage he had nearly conquered, and Marianne leaned across the bench to guide his hand, and found the Viscount had come to stand at her shoulder, to watch. close enough that she caught the faint, clean smell of cold air and wool that clung to him from the yard. She did not move. She held herself very still, her own hand steady on the boy's, and she was aware of exactly where the Viscount stood without looking, the way one is aware of a fire in a dark room, and her pulse went on somewhere in her throat, at a pace she did not permit her face to know. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said low that his sister had once played that very passage, and that she had made the same small error in the same place, and had laughed at herself for it. It was the second thing he had ever told her about himself, and she kept it, the way she kept everything he let fall, folded small, and put away where hope could not reach it. When he left the room, she let out the breath she had been holding, and was ashamed of how long she had held it. Her wound was this. She had decided, in the 4 years since her father's death, that she was a person who could be useful, but not chosen. Useful women were kept. Chosen women were loved. She had made her peace, or something she called peace, with being the first kind, and every kindness the Viscount showed her she filed under usefulness, because to file it anywhere else was to hope, and hope, for a woman in a turned gown, was the most expensive thing in the world. The winter deepened. She came 3 mornings a week, and the boy's scales grew slowly, less murderous, and the Viscount contrived more and more often to be in the house when she was, and the household noticed as households do, and the noticing traveled as it does, from the kitchen to the street to the drawing rooms of Bath, and arrived at last, gathering weight, at Lady Fenwick's ear. The dowager did not like what she heard. Her granddaughter had been arranged for the Viscount with the care one gives a difficult sum, and now the sum would not come right, and the reason it would not come right was a music teacher in a turned gown. Lady Fenwick was not a stupid woman. She understood that the direct attack, the cut, the exclusion, would only make the Viscount stubborn, for she had watched him long enough to know that he could not be told whom to want. So, she chose a subtler instrument. She invited Marianne to play. It came as a card, cream and correct, requesting the pleasure of Miss Whitcomb's performance at a musical evening at Fenwick House 3 weeks hence. It was, on its face, an honor. A music teacher asked to perform before the season was a music teacher rising in the world. Marianne held the card and did not trust it, and was right not to, and could not have said why, and accepted it anyway because to refuse would have looked like fear, and she had spent 4 years refusing to look like fear. She did not know that Lady Fenwick had already spoken to the 4 other performers of the evening, all of them accomplished young ladies of family, all of them supplied with the newest and most difficult music from London. She did not know that she was to be placed last, after the ice blue satin and the pearls, so that the contrast between what the season valued and what it merely tolerated would be visible to every eye in the room. She did not know that the whole evening had been built like a trap is built around the moment of her humiliation. She found out 3 days before from the boy. Thomas, who heard everything a child hears and understood half of it, told her over his scales that his uncle was cross because Grandmother Fenwick, which was what the boy called the dowager, though she was no relation, had said a thing about Miss Marianne at dinner, and his uncle had put down his glass very hard. Marianne asked lightly, "What thing?" And the boy, screwing up his face to remember, produced it exactly. She said you were the charity case, and it was cruel to let you play. Because everyone would see the third voicing, the one that reached her. She sat very still on the bench beside the boy, and felt the old heat climb her throat, and this time it reached her face, and she was glad the boy could not read faces yet, and she said, "Play the scale again, Thomas, from the top. And this time breathe before you begin." She thought about withdrawing. She thought about it all that night, turning it over, the way she turned the hem of her gown, looking for the place where it could be made to hold. If she withdrew, she was the coward the season already believed her to be. If she played, and played the difficult London music badly, she confirmed everything. If she played it well, she was a music teacher rising above her station, and the season would find some other way to put her down, because the season always did. And then, somewhere in the small hours, she stopped thinking about the season at all and thought about her father instead. She had a folder of his fair copies. His own hand. Pieces the London ladies had never heard because they were old and out of fashion, and beautiful in the way that only unfashionable things are permitted to be. She would not play the newest and most difficult music from London. She would play her father's music, badly, copied by no one, made perfect by his hand, and if the season laughed at it, then the season would be laughing at her father, who had given away a lost quartet because music ought not to die, merely because its owner had. It was not defiance. She was too tired for defiance. It was something quieter and harder to break. She would go into the cruel light one more time, and she would bring her father with her. You are almost at the part where the room turns. First, though, the room has to fall. The musical evening at Fenwick House was more crowded than any ball. Everyone came, because everyone had been told, in the delicate way such things are told, that the evening would be worth attending. Marianne arrived in the tea-colored gown, because it was the only one she had that would do, and she carried her music case, and inside it, folded, her father's copies, and she was placed exactly where Lady Fenwick had planned to place her, last, after the others. The others were very good. Cecilia was very good. She played a difficult sonata with cold accuracy and rose to warm applause, and returned to her grandmother's side with the particular composure of a woman who has never once wondered whether she belonged. And Lady Fenwick's fan rose in satisfaction, and the trap stood ready, and Marianne was called to the instrument. She walked to it through a silence that was not the silence of attention, but the silence of a room waiting to be proved right. She sat. She took her father's pages from the case and set them on the stand, and someone near the front, one of the two girls from the ball 3 weeks before, said, not quietly, "It is hardly even proper music. Look, it is written by hand," and the little bright laugh went round the room like a spoon against china, and Marianne's hands, for one terrible moment, would not move. She looked up, then, not at the room, but past it, at the tall windows, and she began to count the panes, the way she had counted them at the ball, the way she had counted them all her life, when the room decided not to see her. And in the counting, she found her father, and she put her hands on the keys, and she began to play. She played the first of his copies, a slow air she had known before. She knew her own name. She did not play it to impress. She played it the way he had taught her, as though the notes were words, and the phrases were sentences, and the whole of it was a thing one person says to another, in a low voice, and the room which had come to laugh found within a dozen bars that it could not. The little bright laugh did not come again. Somewhere in the middle of the air, a woman near the back began very quietly to cry, and did not know why, and would not have been able to explain it, except that the music was saying a thing she had not let herself hear in years. Marianne did not see any of this. She was with her father in a house that no longer stood. The Viscount saw it, though. He stood at the side of the room where he had placed himself deliberately, and he watched the season come to the instrument to mock a woman and find itself one face at a time, unable to pause. And Lady Fenwick, watching her trap invert itself in real time, made the error that confident people make when their instruments fail. She reached for a blunter one. She rose while the last notes of the air were still in the air, before the applause could gather and set, and she said, in a voice pitched to carry, warm and terrible with concern, "How affecting, and how brave to bring us such humble old things. When one cannot command the new, we must all admire a woman who makes the best of a reduced situation." She smiled around the room. The charity case has quite exceeded herself tonight. It was meant to reframe the tears as pity. It was meant to put Marianne back at the edge of the light where the season had decided she belonged. And for a moment it might have worked, because that is how such rooms work, and Marianne, at the instrument, felt the old cold settle over the brief warmth and reached to gather her father's pages and withdraw. The Viscount crossed the room in 6 strides. He did not hurry. That was the thing every witness would remember afterward, the thing they would describe to people who had not been there. He did not rush, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not so much as glance at Lady Fenwick. He walked to the instrument through a room gone utterly still, and he stopped beside the bench where Marianne sat with her father's music half gathered in her hands, and he looked at her, and only at her, and the whole of the season held its breath. "Miss Whitcomb," he said. It was the first time he had used her name in her hearing, and he used it the way one lays down something valuable. Then he turned at last to face the room, and he set his hand very lightly on the back of the bench near her shoulder, not touching a hand that said what it protected, and he spoke the only words he would speak. "I intend to marry her." Play on. Marianne. 12 words. No more. He did not defend her against the charge, because to defend her was to grant the charge standing. He did not humiliate the dowager because the dowager had already, in the silence that followed, been humiliated by the room's own turning. He simply announced in the same arena where the season had rendered its verdict that the verdict was overturned, and named the woman by her Christian name in front of the very people who had called her a charity case, and asked her, not commanded her, to continue. The room did not gasp. It exhaled. Somewhere the woman who had been crying made a small sound that was almost a laugh, and near the front one of the two bright girls went white, and Lady Fenwick's fan, held so long at its half-inch of superiority, came down and lay in her lap, forgotten, while she performed the rapid private arithmetic of a woman discovering that her sum had come right for someone else. Entirely Cecilia, to her lasting credit, was the first to applaud. She was a lovely girl who had been told all her life she was the correct choice, and she understood, in that moment, faster than her grandmother, that being the correct choice and being chosen are not the same thing, and she set down the injury of it and clapped because the music deserved it, and because the woman at the instrument had earned the room the honest way. Marianne did not rise. She did not weep. She looked at the Viscount for the length of one held breath, long enough to see that his face, which the season had called cold for years, was not cold, and had perhaps never been, and then she did the only thing that answered him properly. She turned back to the keys. And she played on. She played the second of her father's copies, and this time the room listened, as a room listens when it has been corrected, and knows it. When she finished, there was a silence, and then there was the kind of applause that cannot be arranged, and Lady Fenwick sat through it with her fan in her lap and did not fragment cruelly, and was not made to, because the season had already taken from her the only thing she had wanted, which was to be right. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the candles had begun to gutter, the Viscount found Marianne in the small anteroom where she had gone to be, for one moment, unwatched. She was standing with her father's pages in her hands, refolding them along their worn creases, and she did not hear him come in. "You need not have said it," she said, when she felt him there. She did not turn the marrying. "You said it to silence her. I understood. I am grateful. But you need not hold to it. A man may unsay a thing spoken in a room, Marianne." He said her name again, and she turned, because she could not turn when he said it, that way. "Look at me, and tell me you believe I said it to silence her." She looked at him. She had spent 4 years learning to read the small betrayals of the body, because the body was the only honest thing in a room full of arrangements, and she read his now the stillness. There was not coldness but the enormous effort of a man holding still. The hand that had gone again to the breast of his coat, and this time drawn something out. It was a letter, folded small, worn soft at the folds, the way her father's music was worn. "My sister," he said. "Thomas's mother. She married a man the family approved, and the man did not approve of her. And the season watched her diminish for 6 years, and called it a good match, and I was too young and too far away and too much a coward to cross the room. When she died, I told myself I would not stand still again." His voice did not break. It was worse than breaking. "I have watched you count window panes since the night of the ball. I know what a person is doing when they count. I crossed the room, Marianne. This time I crossed the room." She understood then what she had filed under usefulness. She understood the come inside and the sit down and the eat something. And she understood the hand that had rested over his coat where the letter lived, and she understood that she had not been kept because she was useful. She had been seen. From the first night, in the cruel light, when she thought no one was looking, she had been seen. "I copied music," she said, which was not what she meant, but her father's pages were in her hands and she could not put down the thing she meant any other way. After he died, I could not bear to sell the copies. I told myself it was sentiment. It was not sentiment. It was that they were the only proof that he had been here, that he had loved a thing enough to save it, for people who would never thank him. "I know," the Viscount said. "You told a frightened child you had once found a whole quartet everyone said was lost. I have thought about that sentence every day since." He paused. "It was my quartet, Marianne, the one your father copied and gave away. The man he sent it to was my old master at music. I have the copy still. I did not know whose hand it was until the night of the ball. And then I knew, and I have been trying to cross a room ever since." She did not answer at once. She looked down at the letter in his hand, worn soft the way grief wears a thing that is handled too often. And she thought of all the mornings she had come to this house and told herself she was only a teacher of scales, and of all the small commands she had misread, and she found that her hands had begun, without her leave, to shake. She set her father's pages down on the little table so that she would not crease them, and she pressed her palms flat against the wood to still them, and when she spoke her voice was steadier than she was. She told him that she had believed, for 4 years, that she was a woman who could be needed and never wanted, and that she had built her whole peace on that belief, the way one builds a house on ground one knows to be poor, because poor ground was the only ground she had been given. She told him it was easier to be a charity case than to be disappointed. He listened without moving, and when she had finished he crossed the last of the small room, and he did not take her hands, though she saw him want to. He waited until she lifted them herself. The circle closed. The lost quartet, given away by a ruined gentleman so that music should not die with its owner, had traveled across 4 years and 2 griefs, and arrived, folded, in the breast of a man's coat, in an anteroom in Bath, and it had brought 2 people to the same instrument. Marianne looked at the letter in his hand, and the music in her own. Both of them worn soft at the folds, both of them saved, because someone could not bear to let a loved thing die. And she stopped, at last, doing the arithmetic that made her a charity case because the sum had never been hers to do. The season had done it wrong. Her father had done it right. A thing is worth what someone will cross a room for. They were married in the spring, in the small church near Laura Place, without a crush, without the season, with the boy Thomas holding the ring and getting it wrong and being forgiven for it. Lady Fenwick was not there, having removed to the country for her health, which was the season's way of saying she had lost, and the season let her save that much, because the season, corrected, is not cruel, only confident, and confidence can survive a great deal of being wrong so long as it is not made to say so aloud. Cecilia came. She had grown, in a single winter, into a woman who could tell the difference between what she had been promised and what was true, and she wished Marianne well, and meant it, and married. 2 years later, a man who chose her the honest way, and was happy. The house on Laura Place learned music. The Viscount was not musical and never became so, but he learned to sit in the room while it was played, which is its own kind of musicianship, and the boy Thomas grew and his scales stopped being murder and became, eventually, something like conversation. And on winter evenings, when the fire was lit and the snow came down past the tall windows that Marianne no longer needed to count, she played her father's copies, the old unfashionable beautiful things, and her husband sat with his sister's letter in the breast of his coat and his wife's music in the air, and the 2 saved things kept each other company at last. She kept the folder always. She did not need to hide it anymore, and so of course she found she wanted to, more than ever, the way a person guards most carefully the thing they have finally been allowed to set down. It lived on the top of the instrument now, in plain sight, in her father's hand. And sometimes, when a phrase was very fine, she would stop in the middle of it and leave it unfinished in the air, the way one leaves a door open for someone expected home. If Marianne's journey stayed with you, stay a moment longer and let it settle. And if you found something in it worth carrying, leave a word below to tell me which moment it was. There was a night once when a whole glittering room decided. A woman in a threadbare gown was worth nothing, and one man rose and bowed and proved the room wrong, not by shouting it down but by crossing the floor. That is the whole of it. That is all it ever takes. Someone has to be willing to cross the room. And on the coldest night of that first winter, when the snow lay deep on Laura Place and the fire had burned low, she played the slow air one last time before bed, the first of her father's copies. The one she had known before she knew her own name. And she reached the final phrase. She let it hang there, one note short, in the warm dark of a house that was hers now, and she closed the instrument. And she went up to her family, and behind her on the stand, her father's pages lay open in his own good hand. The ink, long dry. The music finally, after everything,